I never thought my peaceful retirement would turn into a nightmare because of one vindictive neighbor. What started as minor complaints escalated into a full-blown harassment campaign that nearly cost me my home. This story changed my life forever. If you want more stories like this, please subscribe and hit that like button. Where are you watching from? My name is Elena Ramirez. I'm 56 years old, and I've lived in the same house in Oakwood Heights for 12 years. It's a modest 2-story home with a small front garden that I've lovingly maintained since my husband passed away 3 years ago. The neighborhood had always been quiet, filled with working families and retirees like myself. That was until Diane Fletcher moved in next door 8 months ago. Diane is a woman in her early 40s with sharp features and an even sharper tongue. She works from home as some kind of consultant and seems to spend most of her time peering out her front window, keeping tabs on everyone's business. From day one, she made it clear she had opinions about how the neighborhood should look and operate. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in March. I was watering my tomato plants when a white pickup truck pulled into my driveway. A tired-looking man in a polo shirt climbed out, clipboard in hand. "Ma'am, I'm Jim Rodriguez from the City Code Enforcement Office. We received a complaint about unpermitted structures on your property. Mind if I take a look around?" My heart sank. "Unpermitted structures? I don't understand. What structures?" Jim gestured toward my small wooden garden shed that had been there when I bought the house. "That shed there, and allegedly some kind of fence extension that's blocking a neighbor's view." I followed him around the backyard, watching as he measured and photographed everything. The shed was clearly old and weathered, obviously predating my ownership. The fence he mentioned was just a small trellis I'd installed for my climbing roses, barely 3 feet high. "This is ridiculous," I said, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. The shed came with the house, and that trellis couldn't block anyone's view of anything. Jim looked sympathetic. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am. I'll file my report, but between you and me, this looks like a neighbor dispute more than actual code violations." As he drove away, I noticed Diane standing at her kitchen window, arms crossed, watching the entire interaction with what looked like satisfaction. That evening, my daughter Carmen came over for our weekly dinner. At 28, Carmen has my stubborn streak, but her father's diplomatic nature. She works as a paralegal downtown and has always been my voice of reason during difficult times. "Mom, you look upset," she said the moment she walked through the door, setting down a bag of groceries. "What happened?" I told her about the code enforcement visit while we prepared dinner together in my small but cozy kitchen. Carmen's expression grew darker with each detail. "So let me get this straight," she said, chopping vegetables with perhaps more force than necessary. "This woman moves in 8 months ago and immediately starts causing problems for you?" "It gets worse," I admitted. "Remember last month when I told you about the parking complaint? Someone reported that I was parking my car too close to the property line, and the week before that, they claimed my sprinklers were causing water runoff onto city property." Carmen stopped chopping and looked at me directly. "Mom, all of these complaints, they're coming from the same source, aren't they?" "I think so. The timing is too coincidental. Every complaint has come right after I've had some kind of interaction with Diane." We sat down to eat, but my appetite was gone. The stress was eating at me. At 56, I should be enjoying my retirement, tending my garden, and spending time with my daughter. Instead, I was living in fear of the next official knock on my door. The next morning, I decided to talk to my neighbor Ruth Chen, who lives across the street. Ruth is 62, a retired librarian with a keen eye for detail and a network of neighborhood connections that spans decades. She's been my closest friend since I moved to Oakwood Heights, and if anyone would know what was really going on, it would be her. I found Ruth in her front yard, deadheading her prize-winning roses. She looked up as I approached, immediately reading the worry on my face. "Elena, honey, you look terrible. What's wrong?" I explained the code enforcement visits, the pattern of complaints, and my growing suspicion about Diane's involvement. Ruth listened carefully, her expression growing more concerned. "I was afraid something like this might happen," Ruth said, setting down her pruning shears. "Elena, I need to tell you something. Last week, I saw Diane taking photos of your house from different angles. She was being very deliberate about it, measuring things with a tape measure." My stomach dropped. "She was measuring my property?" "It looked that way, and there's more. She's been asking other neighbors questions about you, specifically about whether you've made any changes to your house or yard since you moved in." I felt a chill despite the warm morning sun. "Ruth, what should I do? I can't afford legal fees, and I don't understand why she's targeting me." Ruth took my hand gently. "We need to be smart about this. Start documenting everything. Every interaction, every complaint, every official visit. And Elena?" "What?" "I don't think this is random. Yesterday, I overheard Diane on her phone in her backyard. She was talking to someone about property values and mentioned your house specifically. She said something about problem properties bringing down the whole street." The pieces were starting to come together, but I still didn't understand the full picture. Diane Fletcher had turned my peaceful life into a series of battles I never wanted to fight. One small detail blew the whole thing open. That night, I couldn't sleep. Ruth's words kept echoing in my mind. Problem properties bringing down the whole street. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to understand what Diane could possibly find problematic about my modest two-story colonial. I'd maintained it carefully since moving in 3 years ago after Tom passed. The white paint was fresh, the shutters were straight, and my small front garden was neat and colorful. At 3 a.m., I gave up on sleep and made myself tea, settling into my kitchen nook where I could see Diane's house through the window. Her Tudor-style home loomed larger than mine, with its perfectly manicured lawn and expensive landscaping. Not a single blade of grass was out of place. Not one flower dared to grow beyond its designated border. It was beautiful in a cold, catalog-perfect way that made me feel shabby by comparison. The next morning, I called Sarah. My daughter's voice was strained when she answered, and I could hear the familiar sounds of her office in the background. Phones ringing, muffled conversations, the constant hum of productivity that defined her marketing firm. "Mom, I only have a few minutes before my next meeting. What's happening with the code enforcement thing?" I told her about Ruth's observations, the photographing, the measuring, the overheard phone conversation. With each detail, Sarah's breathing became more audible, the way it did when she was trying to control her temper. "This is harassment, Mom. Plain and simple. You can't let her terrorize you like this." "But what if she finds something real? What if there actually is a violation I don't know about?" The fear in my voice surprised even me. "Sarah, I'm scared to even water my flowers now. What if my garden hose is violating some ordinance? What if my mailbox is 2 inches too close to the sidewalk?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her typing, probably dealing with work while trying to comfort me. The reality of her divided attention stung, even though I understood she was busy. "Mom, listen to me. You're a good homeowner. You've never had problems anywhere else you've lived. This woman is creating problems that don't exist, and you're letting her get inside your head." After we hung up, I spent the morning walking through my house and yard with new eyes, trying to see what Diane might see. Was my fence too high? Were my trash cans positioned wrong? I found myself measuring distances with a tape measure I'd never owned until yesterday, when I'd bought one in a panic at the hardware store. The absurdity of my situation hit me as I crouched beside my front steps, measuring their height against what I thought might be building codes I'd never needed to know. Here I was, a 56-year-old retired teacher, cowering in my own yard because a neighbor had weaponized the system against me. That afternoon, Ruth appeared at my kitchen door with a plate of her famous oatmeal cookies and a determined expression I recognized from her librarian days. "Elena, we need to talk strategy. I've been thinking about this all night." We sat at my kitchen table, the same spot where I'd received those dreaded phone calls from code enforcement. Ruth spread out a small notebook, her handwriting neat and purposeful across the pages. "I've been keeping track of Diane's activities since you told me what was happening. 3 times this week, she's walked the perimeter of your property. Yesterday, she spent 20 minutes examining your mailbox and the area around it. She's building a case, Elena, but we can build one too." Ruth's methodical approach both comforted and alarmed me. "You mean spy on her?" "I mean, document the truth. She's harassing you, and harassment has patterns. We just need to make the pattern visible." As we talked, I watched Diane's house through my window. She emerged from her front door, dressed in her usual pristine khakis and polo shirt, carrying what looked like a measuring tape and a camera. My heart started racing as she walked directly toward my property line. "Ruth, she's coming over here." We watched as Diane positioned herself at the edge of my driveway, taking photos of my house from multiple angles. She was completely brazen about it, no longer trying to hide her surveillance. The violation of privacy felt almost physical, like someone rifling through my personal belongings. "That's it," Ruth said, her voice carrying the authority that had once commanded respect in library reading rooms. "Elena, tomorrow we're going to code enforcement ourselves. Not to respond to a complaint, but to file one." I stared at my friend, this woman who had become my anchor in this storm of confusion and fear. "File a complaint about what?" Ruth's smile was grim but determined. "About harassment, about a neighbor who's abusing the system. But first, there's something else we need to find out. Something about why she's really doing this." She paused, looking out at Diane, who was now measuring something near my mailbox with shocking boldness. "Elena, I think I know what this is really about. And if I'm right, everything we've been assuming is wrong." Ruth's cryptic comment about everything being wrong stayed with me through a sleepless night. The next morning, I found myself pacing the kitchen, coffee growing cold in my hands as I watched Diane's house for any signs of movement. The woman had turned me into a prisoner of my own paranoia. When Ruth arrived at 9 sharp, she carried a folder thick with papers and wore the expression of someone who had solved a puzzle. "I couldn't sleep either, so I did some research," she said, settling into her usual chair. "Elena, when did you say you moved into this house?" 15 years ago this October. You know that, Ruth. You helped me paint the living room that first winter." "And Diane moved in when?" I had to think. The neighborhood had been so peaceful before her arrival that I'd barely paid attention to the transition. "Maybe 3 years ago. The previous owners were the Hendersons, that elderly couple who moved to Florida." Ruth nodded, opening her folder. "The Hendersons owned that house for 42 years. I looked it up at the county recorder's office yesterday evening. But here's what's interesting. They tried to sell it twice before Diane bought it. Both deals fell through. I don't understand what this has to do with property surveys, Elena. Both failed sales were because of property line disputes. Apparently, there's been confusion about the exact boundaries between your lot and theirs for decades." My stomach dropped. "What kind of confusion?" Ruth pulled out a photocopied document. "According to the county records, there are 2 different surveys on file for your property. one from 1987 and another from 2003. They don't match. I stared at the papers, the technical drawings and measurements meaningless to me. Are you saying Diane thinks part of my property belongs to her? I'm saying Diane bought a house with a known boundary dispute, and now she's systematically documenting every structure, improvement, and feature on what she believes might be her land. The measuring tape, the photographs, the obsessive focus on my mailbox, my garden shed, even the decorative border stones I'd placed along what I thought was my property line. It wasn't random harassment. It was evidence gathering. But Elena, Ruth continued, the thing is, even if there is a legitimate survey question, what she's doing is completely wrong. You can't just start filing false code violations to pressure someone. That's still harassment, regardless of her motivations. I felt dizzy. 15 years of believing this was my home, my sanctuary, and now the very ground beneath it was uncertain. What am I supposed to do with this information? We're still going to code enforcement, but now we know what questions to ask, and we're going to be prepared. Before I could respond, we heard the distinctive sound of Diane's front door slamming. Through the window, I watched her march across her front yard with that same measuring tape, but this time she was accompanied by my son Marcus. My heart nearly stopped. Marcus was gesturing animatedly, his voice raised enough that we could hear the tone, if not the words. Diane stood with her arms crossed, shaking her head repeatedly. "Oh no," I whispered. "What is he doing?" Ruth and I moved closer to the window. Marcus was pointing toward my house, then back to Diane's, his movements sharp and frustrated. Even from a distance, I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself when he was trying very hard not to lose his temper. Diane suddenly turned and walked toward my property, with Marcus following. They stopped at my mailbox, that cursed mailbox that had started this whole nightmare, and Diane began pointing at the ground around it. "I have to go out there," I said. "Elena, wait, let's see what happens first." But I was already moving toward the door. Whatever this was, I couldn't hide in my kitchen while my son confronted my tormentor. As I stepped outside, I caught the tail end of their conversation. "Completely ridiculous accusation," Marcus was saying, his voice tight with controlled anger. "My mother has lived here for 15 years without a single complaint." Diane's response was crisp and cold. "Your mother's mailbox is 18 inches into my property. I have documentation." "Documentation of what? You've been harassing her for months with fake violations." "They're not fake. Your mother is in violation of multiple codes, and now I discover she's also trespassing on my land." I reached them just as Marcus turned toward the house, his face flushed with frustration. When he saw me, his expression shifted to something protective and worried. "Mom, this woman is claiming our mailbox is on her property. She says she's going to have it removed by the county." Diane looked directly at me for the first time in months. "Mrs. Vasquez, we need to discuss the boundary issues between our properties. I've had a new survey done, and there are several encroachments that need to be addressed." The formality of her tone, the way she said encroachments, like I was some kind of criminal, it sparked something in me that months of anxiety and fear hadn't quite extinguished. "Ms. Chen, before we discuss anything, I think we need to address your harassment campaign. The fake code violations, the constant surveillance, the attempts to intimidate me into, what exactly? Moving?" For just a moment, something flickered across her face. Surprise, maybe, that I was finally confronting her directly. "I don't know what you mean by harassment. I've simply been reporting legitimate code violations and researching property boundaries that affect my investment." Your investment? The words came out sharper than I intended. Marcus stepped closer to me, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed. Mom, you don't have to explain anything to her. Not until we know exactly what we're dealing with. Diane's jaw tightened. What you're dealing with, Mr. Vasquez, is a property dispute that's been ignored for years. I bought this house knowing there were boundary issues, and I intend to resolve them properly. She turned back toward her house, then paused. Mrs. Vasquez, you'll be hearing from my attorney about the encroachments. I suggest you contact your own legal representation. As she walked away, I felt the ground shift beneath me in a way that had nothing to do with property lines. Attorney. Legal representation. This wasn't just about a difficult neighbor anymore. This was about potentially losing pieces of the home I'd spent 15 years building into a sanctuary. Marcus put his arm around my shoulders. Mom, we're going to figure this out. But as I watched Diane disappear into her house, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything I thought I knew about this conflict had just changed completely. That evening, after Marcus left for his apartment, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago, staring at the stack of code enforcement notices that had accumulated over the past 3 months. Each one felt heavier now, knowing they might be connected to something larger than simple neighbor complaints. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. How did it go today? You said you were finally going to talk to Diane. I called her back immediately. Sarah had been my anchor through all of this, the one person who could talk me down from the ledge when the anxiety became overwhelming. It's worse than I thought, I said as soon as she picked up. She's claiming parts of my property belong to her. She mentioned getting an attorney. Sarah's sharp intake of breath was audible. Elena, what exactly did she say about the property lines? She said she had a new survey done, and there are encroachments. She specifically mentioned our mailbox being on her land. But Sarah, I've lived here 15 years. When I bought this house, everything was clearly marked. The mailbox has been in the same spot since before she even moved in. Surveys can be wrong, Sarah said, her voice taking on that practical tone she used when she was trying to solve a problem. Or they can be manipulated if you know what you're doing. Did she show you any documentation? No, she just made the claims and walked away. But the way she said investment when talking about her house, it didn't sound like she's thinking of this as her home. It sounded calculating. There was a pause before Sarah spoke again. Elena, I need to ask you something, and I don't want you to take this the wrong way. Have you actually looked at your property deed recently? Do you have copies of the original survey from when you bought the house? The question hit me like a physical blow. Yes, I have them somewhere. In my file cabinet. But Sarah, why would I need to prove I own my own property? This is insane. It's not insane if someone is challenging your ownership. And if Diane really did have a survey done, she spent money on this. People don't spend money on surveys unless they think they can get something out of it. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, the anxiety that had become my constant companion since this whole situation started. What if she's right? What if somehow the boundaries are wrong and I've been living on property that isn't mine? Elena, stop. Take a breath. You're spiraling, and that's not going to help anyone. Sarah was right. I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting the way my therapist had taught me years ago after David died. Okay, I said after a moment. What do I do? First, you find those documents tonight. Your deed, your original survey, anything you have about property lines. Second, tomorrow you call the county recorder's office and get copies of everything they have on file for both properties. Third, you document everything Diane has said and done, including today's conversation. The practical steps helped center me. Marcus was there today. He heard the whole thing about the attorney and the encroachments. Good. Having a witness matters. Elena, I know this feels overwhelming, but you're not helpless here. You have rights, and you have people who care about you. After we hung up, I went to the file cabinet in my home office, a small room that used to be David's study. I rarely went in there anymore. It still smelled faintly of his cologne and the books he'd loved. But tonight, I needed to be surrounded by the solidity of documentation, of proof that this life I'd built was real and mine. The deed was exactly where I thought it would be, in a manila folder labeled House Documents in David's careful handwriting. As I spread the papers across his old desk, I felt a strange comfort, as if he was there helping me navigate this crisis. The property description was dense legal language, but the survey was clearer. According to the diagram, the mailbox was definitely on my property, a full 3 feet from the boundary line. The garden area where I'd planted roses last spring was also clearly within my boundaries. My phone rang, startling me. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. Mom, I've been thinking about what happened today, and I'm worried about you dealing with this alone. I'm not alone, mijo. I have you and Sarah. That's not what I mean. If Diane really gets an attorney involved, you need professional help. You can't fight legal action with good intentions. The weight of that reality settled over me. Marcus, I don't even know where to start with finding a lawyer. And the cost? Mom, don't worry about the cost right now. We'll figure that out. But you need to protect yourself. This woman has been harassing you for months, and now she's escalating to property disputes. That's not normal neighbor behavior. I looked at the survey spread in front of me, at the clear lines that showed my property boundaries. I found the original documents. According to my survey, she's wrong about the mailbox, and about the garden area. Then you have evidence on your side. But Mom, promise me you won't try to handle this confrontation alone anymore. If she approaches you again, call me immediately. After Marcus hung up, I sat in David's chair, surrounded by the paper trail of our life together. We'd been so careful when we bought this house, so thorough about inspections and surveys and title insurance. The idea that someone could challenge that now, could claim pieces of the home we'd chosen together, felt like a violation of something sacred. But as I organized the documents into neat piles, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Clarity. For the first time since Diane moved in, I wasn't just reacting to her accusations. I had facts, documentation, and people who supported me. The next morning, I was in my garden early, checking on the tomato plants that Diane had claimed were code violations, when I heard her back door open. Instead of the usual spike of anxiety, I felt a strange calm. I had my documentation. I had my truth. I continued tending to my plants, waiting to see if she would approach me. The morning air was cool, and the garden was peaceful in a way that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this house in the first place. Mrs. Vasquez. Diane's voice was closer than I expected. She was standing at what she claimed was the property line, holding a folder. I straightened up, wiping my hands on my gardening gloves. Ms. Chen, I wanted to show you the survey results before my attorney contacts you officially. She held up the folder. I think once you see the documentation, you'll understand the situation better. The calm I'd felt moments before wavered, but I held my ground. I'd be happy to look at your survey, and I'd like you to see mine. For the first time since I'd known her, Diane looked genuinely surprised. Your survey? From when I purchased the house 15 years ago. According to that documentation, both my mailbox and this garden are well within my property boundaries. Diane's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. Old surveys can be inaccurate. Property lines can shift over time. Property lines don't shift, Miss Chen. Legal boundaries are fixed points. We stared at each other across the disputed garden, two women holding folders that supposedly contained contradictory truths about the same piece of earth. I suppose, Diane said slowly, we'll need to let the attorneys sort this out. As she turned to walk back to her house, I realized that whatever came next, I was no longer afraid of her. But I was beginning to understand that this dispute might be about something much larger than property lines or code violations, something that would require me to fight for my home in ways I'd never imagined. That evening, I called my sister Maria while organizing the survey documents on my kitchen table. "You sound different," Maria said after I'd explained the confrontation with Diane. "Less frazzled." I think having the documentation helps. But Maria, she seemed so confident about her survey. What if there's actually some discrepancy between our documents? Then you deal with it when you know what it is. But Margaret, 15 years ago, you had a professional survey done. You've been maintaining that garden for over a decade. You think you've been accidentally gardening on someone else's property this whole time? I laughed despite myself. When you put it that way, it does sound ridiculous. What does David think about all this legal talk? I hesitated. He's been trying to stay out of it. You know how he gets with conflict. Maybe it's time he stopped staying out of it. This is his home too. After we hung up, I found David in his room, headphones on, working on his laptop. When I knocked, he looked up with that slightly guilty expression he'd been wearing whenever the Diane situation came up. "Can we talk?" I asked. He removed his headphones and closed the laptop. "Is this about the neighbor thing again?" "David, this is your home. When someone challenges our property boundaries, it affects you too." He was quiet for a long moment. "I keep hoping if I don't engage with it, it'll just go away." I understand that impulse, but it's not going away. She mentioned attorneys today. David's expression shifted from avoidance to concern. "Attorneys?" "Mom, are we in some kind of serious legal trouble?" "I don't think so, but I need to know you're with me on this, that we're a team." He nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" "Help me go through these property documents. You have a good eye for details, and honestly, I could use the moral support." We spread the papers across the dining room table. David's presence made the task feel less overwhelming. As we worked, he asked questions about the survey markers and property descriptions that I hadn't thought to consider. "Mom, look at this," he said, pointing to a section of the original survey. "This describes the eastern boundary as extending to include the area where your mailbox is. And see this measurement here? If Diane's claiming your garden is on her property, her lot would have to be significantly larger than what's recorded here." "You think her survey might be wrong?" "I think one of these surveys has to be wrong. The question is, which one?" The next morning, I was watering my disputed tomatoes when Mrs. Patterson appeared at her own fence, coffee mug in hand. "Morning, Margaret. I couldn't help but notice your neighbor was out measuring things yesterday evening with some kind of equipment." I set down my watering can. "Did you see what she was measuring?" "Looked like she was trying to establish some kind of line from her back corner to her front yard." "But Margaret, I've been living here for 8 years, and I've never seen any indication that your garden extends beyond your property. In fact, I remember when you first planted it, you were very careful about staying within your boundaries." "That's what I remember too, but she seems so certain." Mrs. Patterson sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "People can be certain about the wrong things. Doesn't make them right." That afternoon, David came home from his part-time job with an unexpected announcement. "I did some research during my break," he said, "about property surveys and boundary disputes. Mom, did you know that in cases like this, if there's a significant discrepancy between surveys, The county usually orders an independent survey to resolve it. What does that mean for us? It means we might not have to rely on dueling paperwork. There could be an objective way to settle this. For the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely hopeful. How do we request something like that? That's the part I'm still figuring out. But Mom, I think we need to stop being reactive. Instead of just responding to her complaints, maybe we need to take the initiative. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, I saw Diane in her backyard again, this time with what looked like surveying equipment and a notebook. She was methodically measuring distances and writing down numbers. David joined me at the window. She's certainly thorough. It's making me nervous. What if she's building some kind of case against us? Then we build a better one. As we watched Diane work, I realized that my son had grown up somehow in the midst of this conflict. The young man standing beside me wasn't avoiding the problem anymore. He was ready to help me fight for our home. But as Diane's measurements grew more systematic and her documentation more extensive, I began to wonder if we were preparing for a battle that was bigger than either of us had anticipated. The next morning brought an unwelcome surprise. I discovered a formal notice from code enforcement taped to my front door, demanding immediate action regarding unauthorized structures and plantings extending beyond property boundaries. The official language made my stomach clench with anxiety. This wasn't just another complaint anymore. It was escalating into something that could have real consequences. David found me in the kitchen, staring at the notice while my coffee grew cold. The morning light streaming through the windows felt harsh and unforgiving, highlighting every worry line that had appeared on my face over the past few weeks. "What's that?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew it wasn't good news. I handed him the paper, watching his expression shift from curiosity to concern as he read. "They're giving us 10 days to remedy all violations or face fines and potential legal action? This is ridiculous." "We haven't violated anything." David's voice carried a new edge of anger that I hadn't heard before. "She's pushing this too far." Through the kitchen window, I could see Diane's house looking deceptively peaceful in the morning light. The perfectly maintained lawn, the precisely trimmed hedges, the spotless driveway. Everything about her property screamed control and order. I wondered if that's what this was really about. Maybe my slightly chaotic garden, with its sprawling tomato vines and informal flower borders, represented everything she couldn't stand about disorder creeping into her orderly world. "I keep thinking there has to be something I'm missing," I said, settling into the chair across from David. "Some reason she's so convinced she's right. Or maybe she just likes being right, whether she actually is or not." Mrs. Patterson appeared at my back door around noon, looking unusually serious. Her typical cheerful demeanor had been replaced by something more purposeful, and she carried a manila folder under her arm. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind, but I did a little investigating of my own," she said as I invited her in. "I've been bothered by this whole situation, especially after seeing that woman with all her measuring equipment." She spread several photocopied documents across my kitchen table. "I went down to the county records office yesterday. These are the original plat maps for our neighborhood from when these houses were built." I leaned over the papers, trying to make sense of the technical drawings and measurements. The maps were dated 15 years ago, showing the careful division of land that had created our small community. "Look here." Mrs. Patterson pointed to a specific section. "This shows the exact boundaries when your lot was surveyed for the original construction. And Margaret, your garden isn't even close to the property line. There's at least 3 feet of buffer space." David joined us at the table, studying the documents with the intense focus he usually reserved for his college textbooks. These are official county records? Certified copies, Mrs. Patterson confirmed, which means they carry legal weight if this dispute gets more serious. I felt a mixture of relief and renewed frustration. Relief that we had documentation supporting our position, but frustration that we needed it at all. So, what do we do with this information? We use it, David said firmly. No more playing defense. It's time to go on offense. That afternoon, I watched from my bedroom window as Diane emerged from her house carrying what looked like an expensive camera with a long lens. She positioned herself at various points along our shared property line, methodically photographing my garden from multiple angles. The systematic nature of her documentation sent a chill through me. This wasn't the behavior of someone acting on impulse or emotion. This was calculated. The clicking of the camera shutter carried across the yards in the still air, each sound feeling like an intrusion into the sanctuary I'd built in my backyard. My tomato plants, heavy with fruit I'd been so proud of just weeks ago, now felt like evidence in some trial I didn't understand. When David came home that evening, I told him about Diane's photography session. He listened with a grim expression, then disappeared into his room for nearly an hour. When he emerged, he carried his laptop and wore the determined look I remembered from his high school debate team days. "I've been researching harassment laws," he announced. "Mom, what she's doing could actually be considered harassment, especially if her complaints are proven to be unfounded. I don't want to escalate this into something bigger than it needs to be. She's already escalated it. That code enforcement notice proves it." David's voice was gentle but firm. "We're not starting a fight. We're finishing one she started." As evening settled over the neighborhood, I found myself standing in my garden, surrounded by the plants that had become the center of this unexpected battle. The tomatoes were ripe and heavy. The basil released its fragrant oils with every brush of my hand, and the marigolds glowed like small suns in the fading light. This space had been my retreat, my source of peace and accomplishment. Now it felt like contested territory. Mrs. Patterson's voice carried over the fence. "Don't let her steal your joy in this, Margaret. That garden is beautiful, and it's yours." But as I looked toward Diane's house, I saw her silhouette in an upstairs window, and I realized she was still watching, still documenting, still building whatever case she believed she had against me. The battle was far from over, and I was beginning to understand that the real question wasn't about property lines at all. It was about who would back down first, and I was no longer sure I was prepared to be that person. The next morning, I woke to the sound of a car door slamming in my driveway. Through the bedroom curtains, I could see a white pickup truck with official markings. My stomach dropped as I recognized the code enforcement officer climbing out, clipboard in hand. I threw on a robe and hurried downstairs, my heart pounding. David was already in the kitchen, coffee mug frozen halfway to his lips as he stared out the window. "She called them again," I whispered, as if speaking too loudly might make the situation worse. The doorbell rang, and I took a deep breath before answering. The same officer from before stood on my porch, looking slightly apologetic. "Morning, ma'am. I'm sorry to bother you again, but we received another complaint about your garden. Something about improper composting and potential pest harboring." I stared at him. "Composting? I don't even have a compost bin." "Mind if I take a look?" David appeared beside me. "What exactly was reported this time?" The officer consulted his clipboard. "Organic waste accumulation, potential rodent attraction, and violation of sanitation codes." We walked to the backyard together, and I watched him examine every corner of my garden. He looked under plant leaves, checked around the base of my tomato cages, and even peered behind the small garden shed that housed my tools. "Ma'am, I don't see any evidence of improper waste disposal or pest issues. Your garden looks well maintained to me." He made notes on his clipboard. "I'll be documenting this as an unfounded complaint." After he left, I sank onto my back steps, feeling drained despite it being barely 9 in the morning. David sat beside me, his jaw tight with anger. "This is getting ridiculous, Mom. She's wasting city resources with these false reports." Mrs. Patterson's voice came from over the fence. "Margaret, dear, are you all right? I saw the truck." I filled her in on the morning's events, and I could hear the frustration in her voice when she responded. "That woman is out of control. I've been keeping track of these incidents, and this is the 4th time in 2 weeks. That's harassment, plain and simple." The afternoon brought an unexpected knock at my door. I opened it to find Diane standing on my porch, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She looked different somehow, less put together than usual. Her hair was pulled back hastily, and there were dark circles under her eyes. "We need to talk," she said simply. David appeared in the hallway behind me, and I felt him tense. "Should I stay?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "Whatever she has to say, you can hear it too." Diane's eyes flicked to David, then back to me. "I came to tell you that I won't be making any more calls to code enforcement." The words hung in the air between us. I studied her face, looking for some hint of what had changed, what had brought her to this moment. "Why?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Because I know there's nothing wrong with your garden. There never was." The admission hit me like a physical blow. All the stress, the sleepless nights, the fear that maybe I really was doing something wrong, and she'd known all along. "Then why?" David's voice was controlled, but I could hear the anger underneath. Diane looked away, focusing on something beyond my shoulder. "Because I was angry. Because everything in my life felt out of control, and your garden was just there, thriving and perfect, and I couldn't stand it." Mrs. Patterson's gate creaked, and I saw her walking toward us. Diane noticed too, and her posture stiffened slightly. "I'm not expecting forgiveness," Diane continued quickly. "I just wanted you to know that it's over, and I'm sorry." She turned to leave, but I found myself speaking. "Wait." She stopped, her back still to us. "What made you change your mind?" When she turned back, I saw something I hadn't expected in her expression. Genuine remorse, mixed with something that looked like exhaustion. "The officer told me today that filing false reports could result in charges against me. But honestly, that's not why I'm here." She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. "I realized I've become someone I don't recognize. Someone who tries to tear down other people's happiness because she can't find her own." Mrs. Patterson had reached us now, standing slightly behind me in a show of quiet support. Diane glanced at her, then back to me. "I won't bother you again," she said, and this time when she turned to leave, I let her go. As we watched her walk back to her house, David put his arm around my shoulders. "Do you believe her?" I considered the question, watching Diane's retreating figure. "I want to, but I think we need to stay alert for a while." Mrs. Patterson nodded grimly. "Trust but verify, as they say. People don't usually change overnight, especially when they've been as persistent as she has." That evening, as I tended to my tomatoes in the fading light, I felt a mixture of relief and wariness. The immediate threat seemed to have passed, But I couldn't shake the feeling that this resolution felt too easy, too sudden. People who waged campaigns of harassment rarely simply stopped without some external pressure forcing their hand. As I watered my plants, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Several of my prized tomato plants had been cut near the base, the damage hidden behind the larger leaves. The cuts were clean, deliberate, and recent. Diane's apology suddenly took on a different meaning entirely. The sight of my severed tomato plants hit me like a physical blow. My hands trembled as I knelt down to examine the clean, deliberate cuts. These weren't accidental breaks from wind or animals. They were calculated acts of destruction, hidden strategically behind the fuller plants where they wouldn't be immediately noticed. My mind raced back to Diane's apology just hours earlier. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Had she damaged my garden before coming to apologize, thinking it would be one final act of revenge before her supposed change of heart? Or had the apology itself been a performance, designed to throw me off guard while she continued her campaign of harassment? I stood slowly, my legs feeling unsteady. The relief I'd felt after her visit evaporated, replaced by a cold dread that settled in my stomach. This wasn't over. It might never be over. "David," I called, my voice catching slightly. He was inside cleaning up after dinner, and I heard his footsteps approaching the back door. "What's wrong?" He stepped outside, immediately picking up on my distress. I pointed to the damaged plants, unable to find the words. David crouched down, examining the cuts with the same growing horror I'd felt moments before. "When did this happen?" he asked, though we both knew the answer. "It has to be recent. I was out here this morning and didn't notice anything." My voice sounded hollow, even to myself. "David, she came here and apologized to my face while knowing she'd done this." The betrayal felt deeper somehow than all the false reports combined. Those had been bureaucratic annoyances, but this was personal. She'd attacked something I'd nurtured with my own hands, something that brought me joy and peace. And then she'd looked me in the eye and performed contrition. David stood and pulled out his phone. "I'm calling Mrs. Patterson. She needs to know what we're dealing with." While he made the call, I found myself staring at the damaged plants, trying to calculate if any of them could be saved. The cuts were low, but not quite at ground level. Maybe with some care, some of them might recover, though the late season made it unlikely they'd produce fruit. Mrs. Patterson arrived within 10 minutes, her face grim as David explained what we'd found. She examined the plants with the thorough attention of someone who'd spent decades gardening herself. "This was done with garden shears or a sharp knife," she said, standing slowly. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They cut just high enough to kill the plant slowly, so you might not notice right away." The calculated cruelty of it made me feel sick. This wasn't a moment of rage or impulse. It was planned, methodical destruction designed to cause maximum emotional damage. "I should have trusted my instincts," I said, more to myself than to them. When she showed up apologizing, something felt off. Too convenient, too sudden. Mrs. Patterson nodded. "People like Diane don't just stop. They escalate. The apology was probably meant to confuse you, make you let your guard down." "But why?" The question burst out of me with more emotion than I'd intended. What does she gain from destroying my tomatoes? How does hurting me possibly improve her life? David and Mrs. Patterson exchanged glances, and I realized they both understood something I was struggling to accept. This wasn't about logic or gain. This was about someone who'd found a target for all their frustration and anger, and who wouldn't stop until forced to. "The question now," Mrs. Patterson said carefully, "is what we do about it." The false reports were hard to prove. But this is criminal damage to property. This is something the police would actually care about. I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. The idea of filing police reports, of escalating this conflict even further, felt overwhelming. But as I looked at my destroyed plants, I realized that trying to avoid confrontation had only emboldened Diane. "I need to document this," I said finally. "Take pictures, write down exactly when I discovered it and what condition everything was in this morning." As I pulled out my phone to photograph the damage, a movement caught my eye. Diane was standing at her kitchen window, looking directly at us. Even from this distance, I could see that she wasn't trying to hide her observation. She wanted us to know she was watching. The boldness of it sent a chill through me. This wasn't someone who felt remorse or intended to stop. This was someone who was just getting started. The sight of Diane watching us so brazenly made something crystallize inside me. All those months of second-guessing myself, wondering if I was being too sensitive or imagining things, they evaporated in an instant. She wanted me to know she'd done this. She was proud of it. "She's watching us," I said quietly, not looking away from her window. David followed my gaze, and his jaw tightened. "Good. Let her watch us document what she did." I started taking photos, forcing myself to be methodical despite the anger building in my chest. Wide shots of the garden bed, close-ups of each severed plant, pictures showing the clean cuts that proved this wasn't animal damage or disease. With each photo, I felt myself shifting from victim to someone building a case. Mrs. Patterson had moved closer to the fence line, examining something near the gate. "She didn't just come through your yard," she called over to us. "Look at this!" We joined her at the spot where my garden gate latched. The wood around the latch showed fresh scratches, and a small piece of fabric hung from one of the fence pickets. Dark blue cotton that looked like it came from work pants or a heavy shirt. "She had to force this open," Mrs. Patterson said, pointing to where the wood was slightly splintered. "Your gate sticks sometimes, doesn't it? She would have had to really pull at it." I nodded, remembering how I always had to lift and pull simultaneously to get the latch to release properly. Diane would have had to work at it, probably making noise in the process. The idea of her struggling with my gate in the dark, determined to get to my plants, made my skin crawl. "This helps prove it wasn't random vandalism," David said, examining the fabric. "Someone unfamiliar with your property would have just climbed over the fence or found another way in. She knew about the gate because she's been watching your routines." The word "watching" sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the morning air. How long had Diane been observing my habits? Did she know when I watered, when I harvested, when I was most likely to be out in the garden? The thought of being studied so carefully by someone who clearly wished me harm made me feel exposed and vulnerable in my own backyard. "I keep thinking about her apology yesterday," I said, still photographing evidence. "How sincere she seemed. Was she already planning this while she was standing on my porch talking about being better neighbors?" Mrs. Patterson made a sound of disgust. "Of course she was. That's what people like Diane do. They manipulate situations to serve their purposes." The apology wasn't about making peace. It was about positioning herself to look reasonable when the next incident happened. David had been unusually quiet, but now he straightened up from examining the gate. "Sarah, I think you need to consider that this might not stop with your garden." The serious tone in his voice made both Mrs. Patterson and me turn to look at him fully. He was staring at Diane's house, his expression troubled in a way that made my stomach clench. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew what he was thinking. "Someone who would sneak onto your property in the middle of the night to destroy your plants. That's not normal neighbor conflict anymore. That's obsessive behavior, And obsessive people don't usually limit themselves to one type of target. Mrs. Patterson nodded slowly. He's right. I've seen this pattern before with another neighbor I had years ago. It started with complaints and escalated to property damage, but it didn't stop there. They started targeting anything that brought me joy or peace. I felt something cold settle in my chest as I processed what they were saying. My garden wasn't just my hobby. It was my sanctuary, the place I went to think and decompress after difficult days. Diane hadn't just destroyed my tomato plants. She'd attacked the thing that gave me the most comfort in my own home. So, what's next? I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when I felt anything but steady inside. As if in response to my question, Diane's back door opened. She stepped out onto her patio, coffee mug in hand, and looked directly at the three of us standing by my ruined garden. Then, with deliberate slowness, she raised her mug in what could only be described as a mock toast. The gesture was so openly antagonistic that I actually gasped. She wasn't even pretending anymore that this was coincidental or that she might be innocent. She was celebrating what she'd done, right in front of witnesses. David took a step toward the fence, but Mrs. Patterson caught his arm. "Don't," she said firmly. "That's exactly what she wants. For you to lose your temper and do something she can report." But as Diane disappeared back into her house, leaving us standing there with the evidence of her handiwork, I realized that something fundamental had changed. This wasn't about property lines or noise complaints or any of the petty grievances that had started this whole mess. This had become something much more personal and much more dangerous. The audacity of Diane's gesture hit me like a physical blow. I stood there, staring at her empty patio, my hands trembling with a mixture of rage and something that felt uncomfortably close to fear. "She's not even hiding it anymore," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt strange coming out of my mouth, as if saying them out loud made this nightmare more real. David was still staring at Diane's house with an intensity that worried me. His jaw was clenched, and I could see the muscles in his shoulders tensing. This has gone way too far. Someone doesn't just escalate to property destruction overnight. She's been planning this. Mrs. Patterson moved closer to me, her presence surprisingly comforting. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about your answer. Has anything else happened recently? Things that seemed minor at the time, but now might fit a pattern?" I closed my eyes, forcing myself to think past the immediate shock of seeing my destroyed garden. The question opened a floodgate of memories I'd been dismissing as coincidences or my own paranoia. "The sprinklers," I said suddenly. 3 weeks ago, my automatic sprinkler system stopped working. The repair guy said someone had deliberately damaged the control panel, but I couldn't figure out why anyone would do that. David turned to look at me sharply. "You didn't tell me about that." "Because it seemed random. I thought maybe it was kids or something." But even as I said it, I realized how naive that sounded now. "And there was the incident with my mail. The postal worker mentioned that someone had complained about my mailbox being too close to the street, which made no sense because it's been in the same spot for 8 years. Mrs. Patterson nodded grimly. "She's been testing boundaries, seeing what she could get away with. The garden destruction isn't the beginning, it's an escalation." The full scope of what had been happening began to crystallize in my mind. This wasn't a series of unconnected incidents. Diane had been systematically targeting different aspects of my life, building up to something bigger. The realization made me feel sick. "I need to sit down," I said, suddenly feeling unsteady. David immediately guided me to the small bench I kept near my herb garden. Or what used to be my herb garden. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was seeking comfort in the very space she'd violated. "This is exactly what she wants," I said, the frustration evident in my voice. "She wants me to feel unsafe in my own home. She wants me to question everything and look over my shoulder constantly." Mrs. Patterson sat down beside me on the bench. "The question is, what are you going to do about it? Because David is right. This behavior typically doesn't stop on its own. It escalates until something forces it to stop." I looked at my ruined garden, then at Diane's house, and felt something shift inside me. The fear was still there, but underneath it was a growing determination. This was my home, my sanctuary, and I wasn't going to let her take that away from me. "I'm done being reactive," I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "I've been responding to her moves instead of making my own." David crouched down in front of me, his expression serious but supportive. "What does that look like practically?" "Documentation, for starters. Every interaction, every incident, every repair I've had to make because of mysterious damage." I was thinking out loud now, my mind racing through possibilities. "And I'm going to start being proactive about protecting my property." Mrs. Patterson smiled approvingly. "Good. What else?" "I'm going to stop isolating myself. She's been counting on me handling this alone, getting overwhelmed and making mistakes." I looked at both of them, feeling grateful for their presence in a way that almost brought tears to my eyes. I should have asked for help earlier. David stood up and crossed his arms. "You have help now. But Sarah, you need to be prepared for her to escalate again when she realizes her intimidation tactics aren't working." The thought was sobering, but I found that it didn't terrify me the way it would have an hour ago. "Then we'll be ready for that too." Mrs. Patterson stood and brushed off her hands. "The first thing you need to do is change your daily routines. If she's been watching you closely enough to know when to strike without being seen, then she knows your patterns too well." "You think she's been watching me?" The idea sent a chill down my spine. How else would she know exactly when you weren't home? When your garden would be undefended? Mrs. Patterson's logic was unsettling, but undeniable. People like Diane study their targets. They learn schedules, habits, vulnerabilities. David was nodding along. "That's why her timing has been so perfect. She always seems to know exactly when to file complaints or cause problems for maximum impact." I felt a flash of anger cut through my anxiety. The violation wasn't just about my plants or my property. It was about my privacy, my sense of security in my own space. Diane had turned my home into a place where I was being constantly observed and judged. "Well, two can play that game," I said, standing up from the bench. "If she's going to watch me, then I'm going to start watching back." The words surprised me as much as they seemed to surprise David and Mrs. Patterson. I'd always been someone who avoided conflict, who tried to find peaceful solutions and give people the benefit of the doubt. But standing there in my destroyed garden, I realized that approach had been enabling Diane's behavior rather than stopping it. "What does that mean exactly?" David asked, though there was something in his tone that suggested he approved of this new resolve. "It means I'm done pretending this is normal neighbor behavior that will resolve itself if I just stay quiet and mind my own business." I looked directly at Diane's house as I spoke, half hoping she was watching from behind her curtains. "It means I'm going to start treating this like what it is, harassment that needs to be stopped." Mrs. Patterson smiled, and for the first time since I'd discovered my ruined garden, I felt like maybe this situation wasn't hopeless after all. As we stood there making plans, I realized that Diane had made a crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that destroying my garden would break my spirit, would make me want to retreat and avoid further conflict. Instead, it had clarified something important for me. This was my home, and I was worth defending. The war wasn't over, but for the first time, I felt ready to fight it.